How did the visions of an unknown nun transform the Eucharistic devotion of the entire Church? The Feast of Corpus Christi. It was born from the heart of Saint Juliana of Montcornillon, and her dream of a feast dedicated exclusively to the Eucharist, confirmed by the miracle of Bolsena, instituted by Pope Urban IV and embellished by the immortal hymns of St. Thomas Aquinas. This celebration has for centuries carried the Blessed Sacrament through the streets of the world, reminding us that in the consecrated host, heaven and earth meet in an eternal embrace. Chapter 1. Medieval Origins. 13th century Europe, a time of profound contrasts for the Catholic Church. On one hand, magnificent Gothic cathedrals flourished, universities emerged, and intellectual luminaries like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure shone brightly. Mendicant orders, Franciscans and Dominicans, revived religious life with their return to the evangelical ideal of poverty and preaching. However, this spiritual springtime coexisted with serious threats to the faith, particularly in the form of heresies that undermined the fundamental truths of Christianity. Among these heterodox currents, the most dangerous were those that directly attacked the Eucharistic mystery, the Cathars or Albigensians, with their radical dualism that rejected matter as intrinsically evil, denied that Christ could truly incarnate, and consequently, that he could be present under the species of bread and wine. Other groups, like the Petrobrusians, specifically attacked the doctrine of the real presence, considering it mere symbolism without substantial content. These erroneous ideas spread rapidly, especially in France and the Low Countries, sowing confusion among the faithful and weakening their Eucharistic devotion. In response to these challenges, the Church solemnly reaffirmed the doctrine of the real presence at the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, using the term transubstantiation officially for the first time to describe the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. However, beyond theological definitions, it was necessary to strengthen Eucharistic devotion in the hearts of the faithful through more vibrant liturgical and devotional expressions. The elevation of the host and chalice after the consecration, which began to be practiced at this time, responded precisely to this desire to make the Eucharistic mystery more visible and adorable during the celebration of the Holy Mass. Popular Eucharistic piety also underwent a remarkable evolution. The faithful, who for centuries had participated in the Eucharist mainly through reverent adoration rather than frequent communion, developed a deep longing to contemplate the consecrated host. This phenomenon, known to historians as holy hunger or hunger to see God, was manifested in the fervor with which believers hurried from one church to another to witness the moment of elevation. Thus arose the first local Eucharistic processions and expositions of the Blessed Sacrament. Although there was not yet a specific feast dedicated exclusively to honoring the Eucharist outside the context of Holy Thursday, already overburdened with the commemoration of the institution of the priesthood and the drama of the imminent Passion. It was in this context of light and shadow, of doctrinal threats and renewed Eucharistic fervor, that God would prepare the ground for the institution of a new solemnity. The instrument chosen by divine providence for this mission would not be a powerful theologian, an influential hierarch, or a renowned mystic, but a humble religious woman from the Liège region, whose name would remain relatively obscure in general history, but would shine with its own light in the annals of Eucharistic devotion. Juliana of Montcornillon. Chapter 2. Saint Juliana of Montcornillon. Juliana was born near Liège, in present-day Belgium, around the year 1193. Into a well-to-do family of rural nobility, divine providence, which had chosen her for a special mission, prepared her from an early age through purifying suffering. She was orphaned at the age of 5 being entrusted along with her sister Agnes to the care of the Augustinian nuns of the leper colony convent of Mont-Cornillon. This first contact with human suffering and the generous dedication of the religious women would profoundly mark her spiritual personality, guiding her towards a life of active compassion and deep contemplation. From her adolescence, Juliana showed exceptional intelligence and an ardent love for the study of sacred scripture and the writings of the Holy Fathers, especially Saint Augustine. She learned Latin with such perfection that she could read the original texts directly, something unusual for a woman of her time, especially outside the highest aristocratic circles. This intellectual formation, combined with an intense life of prayer and penance, silently prepared her to understand and transmit the divine message she would later receive. At the age of 13, she took the religious habit at Mont-Cornillon, soon standing out for her humility, obedience, and extraordinary Eucharistic devotion, spending long hours in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. Life in the leper colony was a constant school of heroic charity and self-denial. Juliana served the sick with admirable dedication, seeing in each of them the suffering face of Christ and offering them, in addition to bodily care, the spiritual consolation that can only spring from deep faith and sincere charity. This daily service, far from distracting her from her contemplative life, nourished and deepened it, establishing a perfect balance between action and contemplation that would characterize her entire existence. Her reputation for holiness gradually grew among the religious women and the inhabitants of the region, although she always sought to hide herself in the strictest humility. Around 1230, Juliana's merit and virtues led her to be elected prioress of the community, a position she accepted reluctantly and exercised with exemplary wisdom and prudence. Under her leadership, the community experienced a remarkable spiritual renewal, centered especially on the Eucharistic devotion that she herself lived with such intensity. Concerned about the integral formation of her sisters, she personally taught them the scriptures and the doctrine of the Church, insisting particularly on the centrality of the Eucharistic mystery in Christian life. However, this seemingly ordinary mission of guiding a religious community was nothing more than the preparation for the extraordinary role that divine providence had reserved for her in the history of the Church. The Bishop of Liège, Robert of Thoret, who would become a crucial ally in Juliana's mission, had perceived the authenticity of her virtue and the depth of her spiritual wisdom. He consulted her on several ecclesiastical matters, valuing her discernment and clarity of judgment. This relationship of trust and mutual respect would prove providential when the time came to validate the supernatural visions Juliana would begin to receive. Visions that would propel her to promote a new liturgical feast in honor of the Blessed Sacrament, in the face of initial incomprehension and resistance from many, even within ecclesiastical circles. Chapter 3. Celestial Visions. The supernatural manifestations that would change Juliana's life and leave an indelible mark on the liturgy of the Universal Church began when she was just 16 years old. During her prolonged hours of prayer, especially before the Blessed Sacrament, she began to repeatedly contemplate a mysterious vision, the moon in its fullness, resplendent, but with a dark stain or a black band crossing its luminous disk. This image, which recurred with increasing frequency over the years, left her initially perplexed and disturbed, for she could not decipher its meaning despite her efforts to understand it through prayer and meditation. After nearly 20 years of receiving this enigmatic vision, finally, in a particularly intense mystical experience, Christ himself revealed its meaning. The full moon represented the Church and its liturgical year, while the dark stain symbolized the absence of a specific feast dedicated exclusively to honoring the Blessed Sacrament of the altar. The Lord manifested his desire that such a celebration be instituted to strengthen the faith of believers, to atone for offenses against the Eucharist, and to provide an antidote against the heresies that denied the real presence. This feast was to be celebrated on the Thursday after the octave of Pentecost, separate from the somber context of Holy Thursday, to allow for a joyous and solemn commemoration of the Eucharistic gift. The visions became more explicit and detailed over time. Christ communicated that he himself had chosen her to be the messenger of this divine desire, entrusting her with the mission to work for the establishment of the new festivity. He even showed her some elements of what the celebration should be like: a solemnity with its own liturgy, a public procession with the Blessed Sacrament, and a festive octave. Juliana, aware of her personal insignificance and the enormous difficulties that such an undertaking would entail, felt overwhelmed and fearful. How could she, a simple nun, without authority or influence, promote the institution of a new feast for the entire Church? However, the insistence of the visions and the growing clarity of the divine mandate left her no alternative. For years, Juliana kept the secret of these revelations, sharing the message only with her confessor, Canon John of Lausanne, a man of great virtue and wisdom, and with a few nuns of her utmost confidence, among them Blessed Ava of Liège. This small circle of confidants helped her discern the authenticity of the visions and to mature her understanding of the mission entrusted to her. Canon John, convinced of the authenticity of Juliana's mystical experiences, became her main support and the first promoter of the cause before the ecclesiastical authorities, acting as an intermediary between the humble prioress and the theologians and prelates whose approval would be necessary. The initial response of those who learned of the visions was diverse. Some welcomed them with enthusiasm, recognizing their consonance with the Church's Eucharistic faith and the providential opportunity of such a celebration in a context of doctrinal challenges. Others expressed skepticism or open opposition, considering them the product of feminine imagination or an unnecessary liturgical innovation. This division of opinions would only be the prelude to the difficulties and persecutions that Juliana would face in trying to fulfill the mission that heaven had entrusted to her. Trials that would test her determination and her trust in the divine will, but that would ultimately serve to confirm the authenticity of her charism and the legitimacy of her cause. Chapter 4. Early Obstacles. Juliana's decision to make her visions known and to begin actively promoting the institution of the Feast of Corpus Christi unleashed a series of obstacles and persecutions that would test her spiritual strength. The first front of opposition arose, paradoxically, within her own religious community. When her status as a visionary became known, some nuns, motivated by envy or skepticism, accused her of inventing revelations to gain notoriety and prestige. This internal hostility created an atmosphere of tension and division in Montcornillon, making Juliana's position as prioress particularly difficult and adding suffering to her already delicate mission. The situation worsened considerably when these internal tensions intertwined with local political conflicts. The civil administrator of the leper colony, Roger, a corrupt man who had been embezzling funds intended for the sick, saw in Juliana a threat to his illicit activities because she had denounced his abuses to the competent authorities. Taking advantage of the discontent of some nuns and the confusion generated by the supposed visions, Roger orchestrated a campaign of defamation against the prioress, accusing her of exalted mysticism, disobedience to established traditions, and even embezzlement of the convent's assets, the very crime he himself was committing. This conspiracy culminated in 1246 with a violent attack on the convent by a mob instigated by Roger, which forced Juliana and her most faithful followers to flee precipitously. abandoning everything they possessed. Thus began for the saint a painful period of exile and pilgrimage. She found temporary refuge in several religious houses in the region, but the persecution and slander followed her wherever she went. These years of trial, far from breaking her spirit, strengthened her determination and purified her intentions, confirming to her that the cause she defended was not the product of personal ambitions, but truly the work of God. For she faced exactly the type of opposition that the Lord had foretold for his authentic messengers. A particularly painful blow came in 1246 with the death of Bishop Robert of Toret, who had favorably received the idea of the new feast and had even drafted a synodal decree ordering its celebration in the Diocese of Liège the following year. Without the protection and support of this prelate, Juliana's position weakened considerably. The cathedral chapter, divided in its opinions on the advisability of the new feast, did not immediately implement the deceased bishop's decree. Moreover, the episcopal see remained vacant for several years, a period during which ecclesiastical affairs were left in the hands of administrators less inclined towards liturgical innovations, or to lending an ear to the revelations of an exiled and controversial nun. Despite these seemingly decisive setbacks, Juliana never lost her conviction that the divine will would ultimately prevail. During her exile, she continued to promote Eucharistic devotion among those who welcomed her, keeping the flame of her mission alive under extremely adverse circumstances. Her unwavering faith in the message she received and her humble perseverance in the face of trials deeply impressed impartial observers, gradually gaining new allies for her cause. Among these, the Archdeacon of Liège, Jacques Pantaleon, the future Pope Urban IV, stood out. He personally met Juliana and became convinced of the authenticity of her visions. This seemingly coincidental but providential connection would be decisive for the future of the Feast of Corpus Christi, demonstrating once again how God writes straight with crooked lines in human history. Chapter 5. The First Corpus Christi. Despite Juliana's persecutions and exile, the seed she had planted began to bear fruit, although she herself would not live to see its full blossoming. In 1251, after several years of a vacant see, Henry of Geldre was appointed Prince Bishop of Liège. His administration was initially characterized by greater stability, allowing for the resumption of pending ecclesiastical matters. Among these was the deceased Bishop Robert's decree concerning the celebration of a feast in honor of the Blessed Sacrament, which had been suspended after his death and during the subsequent episcopal vacancy. The new impetus for the implementation of the decree came mainly from two sources. On the one hand, Canon John of Lausanne, Juliana's confessor and the first recipient of her visions, who had never ceased to promote the cause. On the other, Blessed Eve of Liège, a former confidant of Juliana, who lived as a recluse next to the Church of Saint Martin and enjoyed a great reputation for holiness. Eve interceded with the Archdeacon of Liège, Jacques Pantaleon, who in turn used his influence to persuade the new bishop of the advisability of implementing his predecessor's decree. Finally, in 1252, Bishop Henry ordered that the feast be celebrated throughout the Diocese of Liège on the Thursday after Trinity, just as Juliana had indicated in her visions. The first official celebration of Corpus Christi in the Diocese of Liège was an event of extraordinary solemnity and popular fervor. The specific liturgy for the feast, composed by Juliana herself with the help of a young canon named John, different from her confessor, included biblical texts, prayers, and hymns that extolled the Eucharistic mystery with profound theology and heartfelt devotion. The procession with the Blessed Sacrament through the city streets, central element of the celebration according to the saint's visions, attracted an immense multitude of faithful eager to publicly honor the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. This display of popular faith demonstrated how accurate Juliana's intuition had been about the spiritual need for such a festivity. Paradoxically, while the feast she had promoted began to be celebrated with splendor, Juliana remained in exile, far from her beloved Mont Cornillon, and enduring hardships and suffering. Her last residence was the Cistercian Abbey of Fosses, in the Diocese of Namur, where she was received with respect and veneration by the community. There, consumed by an illness she bore with admirable patience. She died on April 5, 1258, without having seen the universal institution of the feast she had so longed for. Her last words were a passionate recommendation to her companions to continue promoting devotion to the Blessed Sacrament, trusting that God would complete the work begun through her. Although she died without seeing the complete triumph of her mission, the events that would follow her death would fully confirm the authenticity of her visions and the importance of her role as a divine instrument. Juliana's funeral, celebrated with unusual solemnity for a simple exiled nun, attracted numerous clergy and faithful who already considered her a saint. Her body was buried in the Abbey of Villers, and soon her tomb became a place of pilgrimage and the scene of miracles attributed to her intercession. Meanwhile, the feast of Corpus Christi, already regularly celebrated in Liège, began to spread to neighboring dioceses, preparing the ground for its upcoming universal institution, which would come from someone who had personally known Juliana and valued her charisma. Archdeacon Jacques Pantaleon, elevated to the papal throne under the name of Urban IV. Chapter 6. The Miracle of Bolsena. While devotion to Corpus Christi was consolidating in Liège and beginning to spread to neighboring regions, an extraordinary event that occurred in central Italy would give a decisive impetus to the universal institution of the feast. In the summer of 1263, a Bohemian priest, whose name some documents identify as Peter of Prague, was making a pilgrimage to Rome, beset by doubts about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Despite being a pious cleric, he was experiencing a crisis of faith specifically related to transubstantiation, probably influenced by theological controversies and heretical currents that questioned this dogma in various parts of Europe. Stopping on his journey, the priest stopped in the small town of Bolsena, located in Tuscany, where he asked to celebrate Holy Mass in the Church of St. Christina. During the consecration, as he pronounced the words, "Hoc est enim corpus meum," "This is my body," something extraordinary happened. The host began to bleed profusely, staining the corporal, the altar cloths, and the floor of the sanctuary. The priest, profoundly shaken, overwhelmed with awe, initially attempted to conceal what had happened, but the abundance of blood and his own turbulence made it impossible to continue the Mass normally. Interrupting the service, the priest rushed to the nearby city of Orvieto, where Pope Urban IV and the Roman Curia were residing. There, falling at the pontiff's feet, he confessed his past doubts and recounted the miraculous event he had just witnessed. Urban IV, deeply impressed by the account, immediately dispatched the Bishop of Orvieto and several theologians to Bolsena to investigate. The papal envoys confirmed the truth of the events, carefully collected the blood-stained linens, and brought them to Orvieto, where they were received by the Pope and the entire Curia in a solemn procession. This Eucharistic miracle profoundly impacted Urban IV for many reasons. First, it constituted a supernatural confirmation of the dogma of the real presence, at a time when it was being questioned by various heresies. Furthermore, the fact that it occurred precisely when the Pope was considering the universal institution of a feast dedicated to the Blessed Sacrament, following the inspiration he had received years earlier through Juliana of Liège, seemed a clear divine sign regarding the opportune and fitting nature of such a celebration. The coincidence could not have been accidental. The very pontiff who, as Archdeacon of Liège, had known Juliana's visions and supported the local celebration of Corpus Christi, now received, as head of the Universal Church, this extraordinary Eucharistic sign. The impact of the miracle transcended ecclesiastical circles and spread rapidly among the faithful, reviving Eucharistic devotion throughout Christendom. The Orvieto Cathedral, where the relics of the prodigy were kept, became a major pilgrimage site. To worthily house these treasures, a magnificent chapel was built, the Cappella del Corporale, decorated with frescoes depicting the miracle, whose walls still bear witness to that supernatural event. Even more significant for the history of the Church, this miracle acted as a catalyst for the papal decision to universally institute the feast of Corpus Christi, thus fulfilling, just 5 years after her death, the longing for which Saint Juliana had worked and suffered for decades. Chapter 7. Pope Urban IV. The connection between Saint Juliana of Montcornillon and Pope Urban IV was a providential link in the history of Corpus Christi. Jacques Pantaleon, who would take the name Urban IV upon being elected Pope, was born in Troyes, France, around 1195, into a humble family. His extraordinary intellectual talent allowed him to receive an excellent education, graduating in canon and civil law at the University of Paris. His ecclesiastical career led him to hold various positions of increasing responsibility, being appointed Archdeacon of Liège in 1240, a position he held when he met Juliana and learned of her visions. During his time in Liège, Jacques Pantaleon had the opportunity to personally appreciate Juliana's holiness of life and the theological soundness of her proposal for the Eucharistic feast. Impressed by both aspects, he became one of the main defenders of the cause, using his influence to have the local bishop implement the celebration. This direct experience with the Belgian mystic and her message would leave an indelible mark on the future pontiff, who would never forget the compelling combination of spiritual authenticity and pastoral opportunity presented by the devotion to Corpus Christi as Juliana had proposed it. After leaving Liège, Jacques Pantaleon's ecclesiastical career continued to ascend. He was appointed Bishop of Verdun, then Patriarch of Jerusalem, and finally, on August 29, 1261, he was elected Pope, taking the name Urban IV. His papacy unfolded during a particularly turbulent period, marked by political conflicts with Emperor Frederick II, tensions with the Byzantine Empire, and threats from the Saracens. Despite these pressing temporal concerns, Urban IV never lost sight of the spiritual dimension of his ministry, and the promotion of Eucharistic devotion held a privileged place among his pastoral priorities. The miracle of Bolsena, which occurred in 1263, acted as the definitive catalyst for the papal decision to universally institute the Feast of Corpus Christi on August 11, 1264, through the bull Transituris de Hoc Mundo. Urban IV officially established the solemnity for the entire Church, setting it, as Juliana had indicated in her visions, on the Thursday after the octave of Pentecost, or Thursday after the Feast of the Holy Trinity. In the text of the bull, the pontiff explained the theological and pastoral reasons for this new celebration: to strengthen faith in the real presence, to foster Eucharistic devotion among the faithful, to make amends for offenses against the sacrament, and to counter the heresies that denied transubstantiation. Although the bull did not explicitly mention Juliana or her visions, possibly to avoid controversies or resistance based on her past tribulations, the content of the document faithfully reflected the inspiration she had received and transmitted. Urban IV included in the bull the granting of generous indulgences for those who devoutly participated in the new festivity, especially in the liturgical offices and the procession with the Blessed Sacrament. the latter element that Juliana had pointed out as particularly important according to her visions. Furthermore, the pontiff commissioned St. Thomas Aquinas, then at the height of his theological genius, to compose specific liturgical texts for the solemnity, thus originating some of the most beautiful expressions of Eucharistic theology and poetry in the Church. Unfortunately, Urban IV passed away just 2 months after promulgating the bull Transiturus on October 2, 1264, without witnessing the universal implementation of the feast he had instituted. The political turbulence that followed his death, including a long period of a vacant see, delayed the effective application of the papal decree. However, the seed was planted, and although the universal celebration of Corpus Christi would take a few more decades to fully consolidate, the pontiff's official act had crowned Juliana's dream and laid the foundation for what would become one of the most important and popular festivities of the Catholic liturgical calendar. Chapter 8. St. Thomas Aquinas' Liturgy. St. Thomas Aquinas' contribution to the solemnity of Corpus Christi represents one of the most perfect encounters between theological genius and poetic sensitivity in the history of Catholic liturgy. When Pope Urban IV decided to institute the feast, he needed liturgical texts that would express with doctrinal precision and spiritual beauty the Eucharistic mystery. The choice of the angelic doctor for this task could not have been more apt. Besides being the most eminent theologian of his time, Thomas professed an extraordinary personal devotion to the Eucharist, spending long hours in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament and frequently receiving mystical graces during the celebration of the Mass. Responding to the pontifical commission, St. Thomas composed the complete office for the solemnity, including antiphons, responsories, hymns, and prayers for the various liturgical hours, as well as texts for the Mass of the day. His work, probably completed between 1263 and 1264, constitutes a true jewel that masterfully combines theological depth, poetic beauty, and devotional fervor. Following the patristic and scholastic tradition, Thomas structured his composition as a comprehensive exposition of the Eucharistic mystery, encompassing its Old Testament prefigurations, its institution by Christ, its theological significance, and its spiritual fruits in the life of the believer. Among all the compositions of the office, the hymns stand out, having endured through the centuries as immortal expressions of Eucharistic faith. The Pange Lingua, with its solemn Gregorian melody, exalts the institution of the sacrament at the Last Supper and articulates with precision the doctrine of transubstantiation. Its last 2 stanzas, known as Tantum Ergo, became the hymn par excellence for the blessing with the Blessed Sacrament, the Verbum Supernum Prodiens. Sung at lauds, culminates with the stanza O Salutaris Hostia, frequently used as an independent Eucharistic hymn. Perhaps the most sublime of these compositions is the sequence Lauda Sion Salvatorem, a masterpiece of Eucharistic theology expressed in verses of extraordinary beauty, where each stanza develops with precision some aspect of the mystery, from the reality of the real presence to the prefiguration of the heavenly banquet. These liturgical texts decisively contributed to the dissemination and acceptance of the feast, for they offered such a solid theological and devotional framework that dispelled any doubt about the legitimacy or appropriateness of the new celebration. The doctrinal depth satisfied the most demanding theologians, while the poetic and musical beauty touched the hearts of the simple faithful. Moreover, the authorship of the already celebrated Thomas Aquinas gave the liturgy of Corpus Christi a prestige and authority that facilitated its universal adoption, even in regions where there had initially been resistance to this innovation. Through these texts, St. Thomas transmitted to future generations not only Eucharistic doctrine in its most precise formulation, but also the devotional fervor and mystical experience of the sacrament that he himself experienced. His own relationship with the Eucharist was so intimate that, according to his biographers, shortly before his death, he received a supernatural confirmation of the truth of his teachings when praying before the crucifix. He heard the voice of Christ saying to him, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What reward do you desire?" To which the saint replied, "Only you, Lord." This personal union with the mystery that he had so masterfully explained was reflected in every line of his office of Corpus Christi, making it not only a theological exposition, but a true act of adoration that continues to inspire the Eucharistic piety of the faithful to this day. Chapter 9. Expansion throughout Christendom. After the death of Urban IV, the universal implementation of the Feast of Corpus Christi experienced a period of slowdown due to the political and ecclesiastical turbulence of the time. However, the celebration continued to be observed in Liège and gradually spread to neighboring dioceses, mainly due to the influence of bishops who had personally known Juliana or had witnessed the Eucharistic fervor that the feast awakened among the faithful. Popular worship thus advanced, sometimes more rapidly than official hierarchical provisions, demonstrating how the sensus fidelium can anticipate and prepare liturgical developments later sanctioned by ecclesiastical authority. The definitive impetus for the universalization of Corpus Christi came from Pope Clement V, who at the Council of Vienne, 1311 to 1312, confirmed and renewed Urban IV's Bull Transiturus. This reaffirmation was later reinforced by his successor, Pope John XXV, who in 1317 included the bull in the Clementines, part of the Corpus Juris Canonici, and actively promoted the celebration of the feast throughout the Church. From then on, the solemnity spread rapidly throughout Europe, acquiring in each region specific characteristics that reflected the diverse cultural traditions, but always maintaining its essence, the public and solemn adoration of Christ really present in the Eucharist. Particularly notable was the development of Eucharistic processions, a central element of the celebration that Juliana had emphasized in her visions. These public manifestations of faith, initially simple and austere, evolved into spectacular displays of popular piety and liturgical magnificence in cities like Toledo, Seville, Cusco, or Mexico. The Corpus procession was transformed into an event that involved the entire community. The streets were adorned with flowers, tapestries, and temporary altars. Guilds competed in the creation of floats and decorative elements. Civil and ecclesiastical authorities participated in a solemn procession, and artistic expressions such as dances, theatrical performances, autos sacramentales, and specialized music enriched the celebration, turning Corpus Day into a true feast of the Christian city. The 16th century, with the religious crisis provoked by the Protestant Reformation, gave the celebration of Corpus Christi a new dimension of doctrinal affirmation. Faced with the rejection of the real presence and transubstantiation by the Reformers, the Catholic Church further emphasized the solemnity, especially in its public and processional dimension, as a visible testimony of its Eucharistic faith. The Council of Trent, from 1545 to 1563, explicitly reaffirmed the traditional doctrine on the Eucharist and fervently recommended the celebration of Corpus Christi, with special emphasis on the procession with the Blessed Sacrament, now considered not only an act of devotion, but also a clear apologetic and catechetical manifestation in a context of doctrinal controversy. The Church's missionary expansion brought the Feast of Corpus Christi to newly evangelized territories in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, where it acquired its own characteristics by merging with indigenous cultural elements. In Hispanic America in particular, the celebration took deep root, developing original expressions that combined European tradition with indigenous sensibilities. Ritual dances, decorations with local motifs, the use of instruments and melodies unique to each region. This enculturation of the Eucharistic feast, far from diluting its essential meaning, enriched it with new expressive nuances, demonstrating the ability of the Eucharistic mystery to incarnate itself in the most diverse cultures without losing its fundamental identity, exactly as the Word itself had become incarnate without ceasing to be divine. Chapter 10. Eucharistic Miracles. Throughout the history of the Church, Eucharistic miracles have constituted extraordinary signs that reinforce faith in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. These prodigies, rigorously investigated by ecclesiastical authorities, have been interpreted as supernatural confirmations of the doctrine of transubstantiation, especially during periods of crisis or doctrinal questioning. Although the miracle of Bolsena was particularly significant due to its direct connection with the institution of Corpus Christi, numerous other similar events have punctuated the history of Eucharistic devotion, nourishing the faith of generations of believers. Among the oldest and best documented Eucharistic miracles is that of Lanciano, which occurred in Italy around the 8th century. According to historical accounts, a Basilian monk celebrating Holy Mass, assailed by doubts about the real presence, saw the host visibly transform into flesh and the wine into blood before his astonished eyes. The extraordinary thing about this prodigy is that the relics have been preserved to this day and have been the subject of modern scientific studies that have confirmed astonishing facts. The flesh is myocardial tissue, heart muscle. The blood is of type AB, and both remain in a perfect state of preservation without any preservative, something inexplicable from a scientific point of view for samples of such antiquity. This miracle, whose veneration has continued uninterruptedly for more than 12 centuries, constitutes a bridge between traditional faith in the real presence and contemporary scientific confirmation. Another Eucharistic miracle of great historical relevance occurred in Daroca, Spain in 1239. During the Reconquista, 6 consecrated hosts, which some soldiers were carrying to receive communion before a battle against the Muslims, were wrapped in corporals and hidden under a stone in the face of a surprise attack by the enemy. When the Christians returned after their victory, they found the corporals soaked in blood that had flowed from the hosts. This prodigy, verified by ecclesiastical authorities, gave rise to an intense local devotion that later became naturally integrated into the celebration of Corpus Christi when it spread throughout Spain. The corporals of Daroca, preserved and veneered to this day, symbolize the union between the Eucharist and the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, reminding the faithful that the same body immolated on Calvary is sacramentally present on the altar. In 1263, contemporaneously with the miracle of Bolsena, another Eucharistic miracle occurred in Santarém, Portugal, when a woman who had stolen a consecrated host for superstitious practices kept it in a chest, from which a supernatural light began to emanate. Upon opening it, she discovered that the host was bleeding profusely. Terrified and repentant, she confessed her sacrilege to the parish priest, who solemnly collected the sacrament and carried it in procession to the church. The miraculous host, preserved in a crystal reliquary, has been the object of continuous veneration for centuries and has survived even natural disasters that destroyed parts of the church that houses it. This fact being interpreted as an additional confirmation of its supernatural character. These and many other Eucharistic miracles that have occurred over the centuries have contributed significantly to strengthening devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and specifically to grounding and enriching the celebration of Corpus Christi. What initially began as a mystical vision of Saint Juliana, thus found confirmation not only in the ecclesiastical authority that instituted the feast, but also in these extraordinary signs that seem to supernaturally ratify the opportunity and appropriateness of a solemnity dedicated exclusively to honoring the real presence. Each of these prodigies, as it became known among the faithful, acted as a powerful catalyst of Eucharistic piety, feeding precisely that fervor that the feast of Corpus Christi sought to foster and channel liturgically. Chapter 12. Significance for the Church. The solemnity of Corpus Christi, from its institution in the 13th century to the present day, has occupied a central place in the liturgical and spiritual life of the Catholic Church. Its importance transcends the purely ceremonial realm to constitute a privileged expression of ecclesial identity, grounded in the Eucharistic mystery. As St. John Paul II affirmed, the Church lives by the Eucharist, and the Feast of Corpus Christi visibly manifests this theological reality, reminding the faithful that the Christian community is born and sustained by the real presence of Christ in the sacrament of the altar. On the doctrinal level, the celebration of Corpus Christi has served throughout the centuries to reaffirm and deepen faith in the real presence, especially in historical moments of questioning or theological confusion. From the medieval heresies that originally motivated the institution of the feast, through the Protestant denial of transubstantiation, to contemporary secularizing trends that dilute the sense of the sacred, Corpus Christi has always constituted a solemn profession of faith in the substantial, true, and real presence of Christ under the Eucharistic species. The public procession with the Blessed Sacrament, a hallmark of this celebration, vividly portrays this faith. It makes Christ present, walking the streets, blessing homes, sharing the everyday lives of his people, just as he did during his earthly ministry in Galilee and Judea. In its spiritual dimension, the feast has fostered Eucharistic devotion in its various expressions: adoration, communion, reparation, and contemplation of the mystery. Practices associated with the solemnity, holy hours, visits to the Blessed Sacrament, spiritual communions, acts of reparation, have nourished the personal piety of countless faithful throughout generations, offering concrete channels to experience a relationship with Christ truly present in the sacrament. The influence of this Eucharistic spirituality extends far beyond the specific day of the feast, permeating the entire Christian life with the awareness of the Lord's constant nearness in the tabernacle. Emmanuel, God with us, fulfilling his promise to remain with his church until the end of time. From a pastoral and missionary perspective, Corpus Christi has served as a powerful instrument of evangelization and catechesis. The public procession, with its festive character and rich symbolism, constitutes a visible proclamation of the gospel in the midst of the secular city, reminding us of the transcendent dimension of human existence and the presence of the sacred in the world. Especially in contexts of increasing secularization, this public manifestation of faith takes on a renewed testimonial value, challenging the confinement of religion to the exclusively private and individual sphere. Furthermore, the preparation and celebration of the feast offer valuable opportunities for the Eucharistic formation of the faithful, deepening their understanding of the sacrament, which is the source and summit of the entire Christian life. As the Second Vatican Council expresses it, the history of Corpus Christi, from the humble vision of Saint Juliana to its present universal celebration, admirably illustrates how the Holy Spirit guides the Church in developing its understanding and experience of the revealed mysteries. What began as a seemingly insignificant personal inspiration was transformed by divine design into a liturgical expression that enriches the life of the whole Church. This process, in which mystics and theologians popes and simple faithful, extraordinary miracles and popular devotions participated, reflects the very nature of the Church as a community guided by the Spirit, where each member, according to their specific vocation, contributes to the common good and the growth of the body of Christ. Thus, the Feast of Corpus Christi reminds us not only of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but also of his living and active presence in the history of his Church, leading it towards an ever fuller understanding and celebration of the Paschal mystery, which is renewed in every Eucharist, prayer to the blessed Sacrament Lord Jesus Christ, who in the admirable sacrament of the Eucharist left us the memorial of your passion. Grant us to venerate in such a way the sacred mysteries of your body and blood, that we may constantly experience within ourselves the fruit of your redemption, you who, inspired by infinite love for humankind, instituted this sacrament at the Last Supper. Enlighten our hearts to recognize you always present under the Eucharistic species. Grant that, following the example of Saint Juliana, we may adore you with living faith, firm hope, and ardent charity. Bless your Church, which each year celebrates with joy the solemnity of Corpus Christi. May this feast strengthen our faith in your real presence and impel us to be witnesses of your love in the world, you who live and reign forever and ever. Amen.